Hey gang, it's Ruben. Welcome back to my channel. Today I have a real nice treat for everybody. I have my guest for this Chatting With series is Ben, goes by the Amateur Exegete. Ben's got a podcast, a website, and he's also quite active on Twitter. And just a little bit about Ben, he spent some time at a Christian college, but decided to go a little bit different route and got a Bachelor of Science degree. He's even looked at some postgraduate work in apologetics, but I guess you've kind of fallen out of all that whole cycle and has deconverted from Christianity. And so I just kind of want to start there, right? You have deconverted from Christianity and you do call yourself a reluctant atheist. So that's kind of an interesting label. Tell us about your story, Ben.
Yeah, so you hit a lot of the highlights. I grew up a Christian. I grew up in a King James only dispensational fundamentalist Baptist church. And I went to a college, Pensacola Christian, that is known for being a King James only fundamentalist school. I didn't finish my degree there. I ended up finishing up my degree at Williamson Christian College, now Williamson College. And they're Christian, but they're more, not liberal, but they're not as fundamentalist, not as conservative. Yeah, so that's, my educational background. I just have a Bachelor of Science degree. That's part of the reason I call myself an amateur when it comes to biblical studies, because I'm not a professional. And so I've done youth ministry. I did do some work in apologetics for a graduate degree, but I wasn't able to complete that. I deconverted from Christianity. It was a long, well, I wouldn't say long, but it took about a year and a half probably. It was not an easy thing. It was very painful. And, looking back on it, I still have a lot of mixed emotions and mixed feelings about it. The reluctant atheist part, though, has to do with my interactions with atheists on Twitter. So, how they can be, right? They can be very emotional and illogical and have no regard for history.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. They can be.
It's awful. And so I put that moniker up in my profile because I just felt, do I believe God exists? No, I do not believe God exists. Therefore, I'm an atheist. But man alive, I don't know if I want to be associated with some of these atheists who are just very intent on being as anti-intellectual as possible. And that because it just bothers me. So I put reluctant atheist up in the bio for that very reason.
Yeah, so let's kind of hit that for a second, because I actually, on checking out your content, I really appreciated that. We'll just kind of expand on this for a second. So for me, right, for those of you that know, obviously my story is I'm atheist to Christian. And so I used to be one of those guys where I would peddle that kind of, that basic nonsense, right? Things like mythicism, which we'll get to in a second. But yeah, and what I really liked, Ben, was that like you did an actual episode, the Spain one, right? And so that you're not afraid to call out just bad ideas, no matter what camp it's coming from, really have me just respect your position a lot.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. Yeah. So it's hard because you want to belong to a tribe, right? You want to belong to a community, and being an atheist, you don't really have one. So it's always difficult to alienate those who agree with you. But I kind of feel like I'd rather be more in the camp of like a Tim O'Neill. I don't know if you know who Tim is. He's an atheist. He does history for atheists.
Yeah, he's an atheist scholar. I actually check out some of his stuff too.
Yeah, I'd rather be in that vein of atheism than the vein of somebody like Richard Dawkins or the late Christopher Hitchens. It's just it's a better fit for me.
Yeah, no, I feel you, man. I feel you. Now, I have a question about your passion for the Bible, because I think it's really cool. So one of the questions I had for you that I want to just, again, keep telling us your story is, have you always been like super geeky about the Bible? And if you did, I guess maybe compare and contrast that love before as a Christian and now as a non-believer.
Yeah, I think I've always been, even from a young age. So in my first adult Bible that I got, like a real legitimate Bible, was a Scofield reference Bible. I don't know. Do you know who C.I. Scofield was? He may not be very familiar. Not many people know. If you were ever in the dispensationalist camp, you might know. But he was a well-known. I think he fought for the Confederacy even. Turn of the century, 19th, 20th century Bible. Not really a scholar. He was kind of a layperson, but he came up with this really neat study Bible that was based on the dispensational teachings of like Darby and well, not Larkin, but people in that vein. And it has like the biblical text and then notes underneath. So that when I got this Bible, I was like 12. My dad gave it to me for Christmas. When I got this Bible, I thought, oh my gosh, this is absolutely fascinating. So I'd read the notes, I'd write in the margins. I was just really into the Bible, and it only increased as I got older, that interest and love for the Bible. In fact, when I turned 18, my dad got me another Scofield reference Bible, but it was a wide margin, calfskin, just top of the line Bible. In fact, just give me just a second here. This is it right here. This is my gift for my 18th birthday, and it's just wide margin. You can kind of see. I don't know if it shows up, but I have notes in there. These are notes from when I was 18, 19 years old. And
what do you think when you look back at some of those notes?
Oh, they're horrible. Yeah, it's cringeworthy. So my love for the Bible has never really diminished. I think when I first started to deconvert, it kind of did. But then it bounced right back, just because the Bible's a fascinating book. But now my approach to the biblical text is way different than it was back then. So back then I'm looking for doctrine. I'm looking for, what do I need to believe? How do I have a relationship with God? I wasn't looking for like literary content, rhetorical maneuvering by the Apostle Paul. These are things that weren't interesting to me. Now though, it fascinates me. I want to know how this book, how these writers view the world, how they present their arguments. So it's the same love for the Bible, just for very different reasons than before.
Well, speaking of different reasons, though, I do want to hit back up on mythicism. And for those that don't really know what this is, right? So mythicism is the term for people that think Jesus Christ is a myth. That basically the whole Bible is fiction, right? And that Jesus essentially is an amalgam of other mythological storytelling. And that's clearly not the case. I believe Jesus is very much rooted in historicity. Scholars pretty much agree with this, both believers and non-believers. And so, one, what do you think about it? And B, like, what is your approach to the overall outlook of what you think the Bible itself is as a book?
Yeah, so mythicism is kind of a funny animal. As you said, it's not very common in academic circles. Every so often you'll come up with someone who has a PhD, usually not in a relevant field, but they'll have a PhD who accepts it on some level. But the problem is the consensus among historians, both those who are Christian, those who are non-Christian, is that there was a Jesus of Nazareth. Now, what he did, did he perform miracles? Did he rise from the dead? These are debated. I don't think that's most of what you find in the New Testament. I don't think is what really happened. But I think at the core is there was a Jesus. He was known to be crucified, and he was reported alive or seen alive by his earliest followers. And I think this is reflected in the writings of Paul. Mythicism tries to kind of circumvent this by turning Paul's Jesus, for example, into a cosmic being who had no earthly existence. So you'll find people like Richard Carrier, who has a PhD in ancient history. He's not stupid by any stretch of the imagination. He's dead wrong on mythicism, but he'll argue that that this Jesus was crucified in the heavens beneath the moon, that he was created by God through the sperm of David. People make fun of the cosmic sperm bank idea that Carrier espouses. So that everything that happens to Jesus doesn't happen on earth. That way, there's no need for an earthly historical Jesus. It's all mythic. It's all cosmic in the mind of Paul. And so, but I don't think the Apostle Paul would have thought that. I don't think any of the earliest Christ followers would have believed that Jesus was merely a cosmic being. I think they genuinely believed he was a human. And I think Paul knew people who knew him. You know, he talks about Cephas in Galatians chapter 1 and 2. He talks about James, who is the brother of Jesus, the brother of the Lord, which mythicists will try to make into something else, but I think the language is pretty clear. And Tim O'Neill actually has a really good piece over his website on Jesus as, or James as Jesus's brother, that people should check out. So yeah, mythicism, I have reservations about mythicism, and I think that scholars are in general agreement that Jesus existed. Just the details are sometimes fuzzy.
Right. And so, well, I'm glad that you definitely are anchored in the historicity of Jesus.
Oh yeah.
I did catch though, right, that you doubt some of the supernatural claims, obviously. And
yeah.
I can understand that lens for a second, but I guess what I'm curious about is, right, the entirety of the foundation of the New Testament is rooted in the basic fundamental principle and truth that these people believed that they witnessed all of these things. They're chronicling this event, right? And whether or not you've got anonymous authorship, firsthand, secondhand, like, I don't really want to go down that road, right? Paul's definitely like chronicling stuff, but he wasn't necessarily firsthand either, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm one of those people that absolutely like trust the writings of Peter, who goes on record in his writings that he was present, right? Was actually Peter. I know there's some debate on timeline, but again, since I'm a believer, I'm going to accept Peter's writings as legit. And I think the burden is to make them illegitimate, and I just don't see enough of that. But anyway, that said, right, the New Testament writers are anchored in the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. And so when I've looked into the secular principle of like folks that are like, well, you know, we definitely like validate Jesus was a real dude, but we're just not interested in like investigating the other stuff. That's kind of more what I feel is the consensus, is that people just don't want to like kind of poke and prod and test whether or not these people were imagining it or not. Whereas obviously biblical scholars are going to lean with the bias that yes, that those events were recorded as best that they could capture. And so, like, again, looking at you as an amateur exegete, you kind of already like put that in its own camp. So what do you think? You're like, well, I trust like some of this and that about Jesus, but like, oh, here's a miracle event, that's nonsense, and then go back to like non-supernatural stuff you trust. Like, I guess I just kind of want to wrap my head around like how you approach, you love the Bible, but yet you don't accept the miracles. What's up, man?
Yeah, it's a consistency issue, right? Why accept some stuff but not others? So, you know, what is the criteria that someone uses to decide what is probably true and what is not? So my answer to that would be, there's a few ways to address it. The first is, I don't think that, and I know you probably don't want to go here, but I have to because it's my position. I don't think that the New Testament writers, specifically the gospel writers, that any of them knew Jesus. I think that what they're writing may be based in oral tradition, oral stories that they've received, maybe. But even if it is, they take a lot of creative license. Even among themselves. So for example, you know, Matthew and Luke almost assuredly used Mark as a source. I mean, it's almost beyond doubt that that they used Mark as a source. And they are very creative with Mark. What they do with his story, changing elements of it, rearranging material. And this is kind of typical of how people in antiquity wrote, you know, histories and biographies. they weren't as concerned about the chronological truth so much as they were concerned about getting out the message of something important.
Right, but they like, here's something though, right? And one of the things that I try to keep myself grounded in, right? And look, when I was an atheist, for instance, like I was one of those armchair quarterbacks that like thought like I could just know about stuff that was definitely like out of my field and just like attack everything at will. And now that I'm a passionate Christian and I have this lens of trying to defend the faith, both evangelically and apologetically, I want to make the mistake of not peddling bad stuff, right? So I look to sources of expertise and I kind of defer to those things. So like, for example, when people say, look, the Gospels are anonymous and the Synoptic Gospels probably lead on mostly Mark, like I accept that. I'm not going to try to challenge it or give an alternate viewpoint. But at the same time, right, look, you've got the writer of Luke that goes out of his way to says, like, I spent time researching this, bro, and like even talked to witnesses, and I'm telling you this as a prologue to what I'm about to chronicle. And like however much is or isn't Mark, like that aside, like the writer of Luke like goes out of his way to do this and then follows it up with like what I call, you know, the sequel, which is Acts, right? I think like Luke is an incredibly trustworthy historian, right? I mean, earlier, like historical experts go a couple centuries back, they were like, dude's like top shelf historian, right? And so there's that, right? I have to like put that in a category. And then, right, the writer of John, right? Here's another thing about reading things in antiquity is we try to think like things we grab off the shelf from Barnes and Noble and like reverse engineer, but you really can't do it. You got to go the other way. These are people in a society that's mostly dominated by illiterate people. So the people that chose to put things on pen and paper, like they had to have a good reason. And to write fiction, I think, is just bad ideation to start with. Like, don't even go there. You can't really defend it. So then we got to look at how does things read. And while I'm not an expert, I'm not stupid, and I know how to read stuff. And when I read the book of John, like the book of John goes into two emphatic things. One, to emphasize the divinity of Christ, which I think is quite unique. And then the second is like it's third person, but it's kind of telling you that the writer was talking to the disciple that Jesus loved. So to me, like he's talking to one of the 12. And so again, I feel like the burden has to be on somebody else to break that down and peel that onion back far enough to say, nah, that's still third or fourth hand. I'm like, no, it doesn't read that way to me, bro.
Yeah. No, I see where you're coming from. So let's start with John, just for an example, because that's a really, really good example. Because the passages that you're talking about, where you have this beloved disciple, or the disciple whom Jesus loved, however you want to put it, it really comes to a head in the final chapter of John, right? So, you know, Jesus sees the 12, not the 12, it's like 7 of them, and they're out in the boat, right? And then toward the end, he starts talking to Peter about Peter's future crucifixion, and then at the end of the gospel, the narrator comes in and says, this is the disciple who was testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true. So yeah, you're right. It kind of seems like that he's talking about someone who was there, someone who saw everything. And in fact, the beloved disciple shows up over and over again as kind of a witness to different events.
With a little bit of an ego, I might say, because like I love the scene where he's like, I outran Paul and got there first. You know what I mean? Like, who, if that wasn't the disciple like telling that story, like why have that little bit of like me ego in there? You know, I just love the little cute moments like that. And
they're funny.
What I love about John is that like the other nuance, like when you read the Synoptic Gospels, you're like, well, there's so much detail when Jesus is arrested, right? And he's back with the Pharisees. But it takes John for us to find out that like, oh, John, by the way, knew a guy who knew a guy, and he's the one that let Peter in. You know, like those little deets, like that's a nuance that makes me trust more that had to have been an apostle telling the story of John.
But the problem is, so the reason I don't think there was an eyewitness behind it. I don't even think the beloved disciple was necessarily an eyewitness. I think this is a character that's been created by the community that stands behind the gospel. Like, for example, the one-upmanship that you just alluded to between Peter and the beloved disciple, which is just, it is a brilliant scene. Like, it's clear that whoever wrote John must have had the Gospel of Matthew, right? Because is it Matthew's gospel where the disciple, it's Peter, and he goes alone to the tomb? I'm pretty sure. I need to double check that before I make a mistake. Maybe it's Luke, but yeah, it must be Luke. Either way, it's just the idea that oh no. Peter didn't go by himself. Peter did not make to the tomb alone. The beloved disciple, the guy who leads our community, he went and he beat Peter. Like, it's creative storytelling, but I'm not convinced it's rooted in any kind of historical fact. So there's a scholar, Michael Koch, who has written a book on this called The Beloved Disciple, the transformation of the Apostle John into the author of the fourth gospel. Really excellent book, not very long, 150 pages maybe. And there's a review of it up on my website if people want to check it out. And he kind of goes through these scenes to connect the dots between how we go from this anonymous individual in the beloved disciple to the Apostle John himself. Like, how do we get to that point? And so he goes through, the patristic evidence, like how the church fathers saw it. But he argues, and I would say pretty well, that, this is not the Apostle John writing. I don't see how it could be, but he does not think it's the Apostle John. He thinks it's the community standing behind it. And he thinks this is a rather late writing, based on, for example, the death of Peter in the end of John. He's, you're going to go where you don't want to go. Jesus alludes to this crucifixion scene that didn't become really popular in Christian literature until the 2nd century. So there's various evidence that suggests this is a early 2nd century composition, and that kind of pushes back the idea that it was an actual eyewitness who stood behind. And that doesn't mean some of the material didn't go back to the historical Jesus, and it might have. But another reason to doubt that it's an apostle is, how did they know what happened at the trial? Because according to the Synoptic Gospels, all the disciples fled.
Right, but this goes back to where I'm saying John adds weight to this, because you've got the Synoptic Gospels essentially trusting Peter's perspective, but in John, it specifically is somebody who has more of an in, right? He knows somebody in power to let him in there. And so John is giving a little bit of a slightly different lens that he can add that corroborating evidence, so to speak.
But that's actually a reason why we should doubt that it's actually John. Because what are the chances that a Galilean fisherman has an in with the high priest of Jerusalem? Those two things don't exactly mash up.
Why?
He would have been illiterate, right? Most everybody in Galilee would have been illiterate. He would have been poor. He would not have been very wealthy. Why him of all people? It never says he's John. It's just an assumption that people make. They just assume it's John the Apostle.
Okay.
It just says the beloved disciple.
All right. Well, let's take this one on for a second. So I'm always going to be cautious to go down that route of majority stereotyping, because it disallows the possibility of individualism, right? And so you could have famous people have pretty mediocre relatives, friends, buddies, or whatever, right? Even famous people today, sometimes they're going to hang out with regular dudes. And so you can extend that same position there, that the beloved disciple could have his own reason for knowing a hookup. That may not necessarily be a Pharisee. It could be a guardsman or whomever. But the point is that there is text in the writing that's saying, I got a way to get in there, right? And so because that's the Bible, the way I read it anyway, is that language in both Old and New Testament is with intent. And so this is not a cavalier statement. The writer is stating that the disciple whom Jesus loved had a way to get into a place that a regular passerby has no business being able to see. So I think there's that matters, right? That text matters. And so to inspect it and just dismiss it, I don't think is a fair assessment of that.
Well, no, I don't think I'm dismissing it. I'm just trying to account for it in light of everything else the gospel says. Specifically about the beloved disciple, he's not named. And given what we know about, especially first century Galilee, which admittedly isn't a whole lot, but we do know that if he was a fisherman, then he was probably a subsistence worker, right? He was trying to live day to day. It's unlikely that he would have had the opportunity, the money to become educated, especially enough to become a pretty competent writer of a gospel. That seems far-fetched to me. I think it's far better to say this is somebody who's had training, obvious training in Greek, not Aramaic, this is Greek, and who therefore must have had some means by which to acquire that training. And so there's a whole bunch of reasons we could go over why I doubt the authorship.
I think this is one of those where we're going to be at an impasse, my friend. But At the same time, I just like to point. The reason why I wanted to point this out was definitely probably not to convince you, because that's not what's going to happen in a short format reading. But is that my position is not unreasonable, and there's defense for what where I take as well. And so that there is a dispute, I acknowledge that, I think it's there, and that we both have a love of the Bible for sure, means a ton. And clearly, that I believe it's inspired word of God as a believer. Mm-hmm. So that you keep digging into the Bible, I'm going to continue to have faith that you're going to come back around someday, Ben. But
you and a lot of other people.
But in the interest of time, let's go to land this plane. So, So like I said earlier, you've got a site and a podcast, and obviously you've got a channel going. So just tell everybody what your content's all about and how they can find you.
Yeah. So on Twitter, I'm at Amateur Exegete, which some people just have a hard time spelling exegete, but it's EXEGET. Wait, did I spell that right? I think I did. But I go by Amateur Exegete there. My website is amateurexegete.com. And there you'll find book reviews and lengthy articles, some counter-apologetic stuff, some counter-atheist stuff. I have two podcasts. I have Bible Study for Amateurs, which is a very short, less than 10 minutes a piece, that goes over, right now where I'm going through an amateur toolbox, what tools you need to do a good study of the Bible. My other podcast their episodes are far more lengthier, and that's Amateur Exegesis. And so season 2, which was last year, I went through the Epistle of 1 Thessalonians and looked at the history behind it, Paul, and went verse by verse essentially through the letter. I have a YouTube channel, which is Ben the Amateur Exegete. So I've got a few videos. I'm not as faithful as I should be in getting those things up there, but I'm trying to do better. I really am. Those are the main places you can find me. The podcasts are available on iTunes, and so people can download them and give them a listen. And I get mail. I get email periodically. Some people they don't like it, and some people do. So can't please everybody.
Well, no, you definitely can't. And I tell you what, I had a great time talking with you, Ben. Thanks so much for coming on my channel.
Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, you got it, man. And for everybody watching, feel free to check out his stuff. Don't be afraid to look at alternate lenses. It's all good, my friend. Have a blessed day, everybody.